Okay, well, I guess we'll start by asking, what does the American dream mean to you?
What a question. I think for me, the American dream is, or at least the American dream that I learned about as a kid, was kind of like pursuing whatever you wanted to and like moving up in the world in a way that makes you like more successful than your parents or the generation that came before you. And I think that always seemed attainable to me in some ways. Like I felt like my parents like offered me a lot of opportunities to do whatever I wanted as a kid. And the expectation was that I was like gonna go to college and like get an advanced degree and like do better than them, as kind of like this social mobility kind of a piece to American dream. I don't know that that's what I believe now. I think I have a much more like cynical view of America, to wonder like if there even is an American dream in that same way. But I think that's definitely what I was taught and thought about growing up.
I just have some questions. Has it played a role in your life? Like, have you thought about the American dream as you've grown up?
Yeah. So, I think that the most acute way in which I have felt the pressures of the American dream is when I was talking to my parents about like what I wanted to do after college, and I was like, oh, like I want to be a teacher, I want to go into education, and they were like, we spent X number of dollars to send you to Harvard College, like the best university in the entire world, for you to be a teacher. Like you could have just done that by going to this school down the street. I think that was a moment where I was like, man, like my parents are both lawyers, like they make a ton of money as it is, and like here I am going to be a teacher, like definitely not like being better, quote unquote, than my parents, or like having the same kind of social mobility in that way. And I think part of that was internalized by me, and I think about, did I make the right career move? A lot of my college friends are like making a ton of money like banking and like doing all consulting and things like that, making more money for other people. But I think that in some ways my life is much more fulfilling than theirs in other ways. And I think that the reality too is that my generation and our generation is experiencing a much different America than our parents did. And so, for example, like our generation is like really challenged by debt and college debt, right? And folks taking out loans to pursue this American dream because education is part of that, but then not necessarily being able to pay off those loans in a way that makes them financially, or I guess gives them a lot of financial stability, right? It means that like home ownership isn't a thing anymore in ways that like my parents owned a home at age 25, right? Like that's not a thing. Those homes are now owned by people, they're being rented out to folks like us who are, you know, working beginner jobs and not being able to afford mortgages and things. So I think that like the reality track of in terms of like gaining social mobility, the rules are different now than they were for our parents, and at least in the United States. And so I think that changes what's actually realistic.
Do you think there's any relationship between like the perceived pressure that someone feels to pursue the American dream and then like the actual success that they may find in achieving it? I guess you need to ask like, how do you think the pursuit of like the quote unquote American dream is different for people who like come from parents who are very persistent in like reminding people that that's the goal versus like say a family that's not even like thinking about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I hear a lot from my friends whose parents are immigrants, actually about some of those pressures a lot more than I think I experienced them. Like I think that my experience of the American dream was much more like an expectation versus like this is just what people do. Like people go to college, like people get degrees, like they get jobs and then they move up in those jobs, right? And hopefully do better than their parents did. But in talking to my friends whose parents are immigrants, most of them people of color, like it's much more of like a pressure, right? Like we came here to give you these opportunities and so you better take advantage of them because like otherwise like why did we like have this experience? Like why did we deal with these hardships to provide these things for you? That definitely wasn't the narrative that I was receiving. And so I think in some ways my my experience was a little bit more like flexible, right? Like I can become a teacher in ways that like is fulfilling to me. And while my parents may have been disappointed in that initially, like I don't care, it's my life, right? Like whereas my friends who are immigrants are like, no, like actually the money that I make as a teacher or an educator or whatever it is, like I actually take that money and like send it back to my family, right? Like, and that's the expectation, right? They offer me so many responsibilities and like this is my role to play in that experience. And so I don't know if it changes what people do, but I do think that it changes how people kind of think about like opportunities that they take advantage of, if that makes any sense.
I guess you talk a lot about like the generational gap and like difference between like your parents and you and like our generation. Have you seen, or do you think that the American dream is different, or that it's like changed over time and that your parents perceive it differently than you do and than we do?
That's a really great question. I think so, yeah. I think like an American has changed too, right? Like I think about the United States, and I also think that it's important to recognize that America refers to like two whole continents. And so like I learned from my summer program to start saying like United Statesian, which sounds weird, but like actually this is like a United States dream, not an American dream. But anyways, besides the point, I think that America, the United States of America and United Statesians have become so much more diverse, both in terms of identities, but also like issues. I think like our generation sees like the American dream as also like a more global, like environmental dream, right? Being able to like live sustainably is like one of the most important issues to millennial voters. And I think we also have a lot more conversations about like wellness and well-being that I hope are part of people's understanding of like their ideal life that weren't the case for our parents.
Who should decide who gets to be American, and who do you consider American?
I don't know. Immigration is like such a like crazy topic, right? And it's definitely something that I don't know as much as I would like to know about. I don't know, I would like to think that anyone who contributes to society in the United States of America is like part of that fabric, right? That includes like international students, right? Like very much contribute to my experience, both at Milton, but as a person, right? That includes foreign-born folks who are now like legal citizens in the United States, right? The reality of the situation is that there are a lot of people who are impacted by domestic United States policies that don't have a say in those, right? So people from Puerto Rico, for example, like are United States citizens, like part of the United States, and like have some voting, but not all voting, right? But they're still domestically impacted by like when President Trump doesn't support hurricane relief in Puerto Rico, right? I think about like students is just one that comes to mind because there are so many international students in the United States with our education system, right? People who like are directly impacted by like visa policies and student loan policies and things like that, who don't have a say in the representatives that are making those decisions. And so it's hard to like come up with what is that line then, because then it's just everyone. But I think that we have to do a much better job at making sure that our elected officials are representative of the people who they are representing, rather than a select group of those people, like the people who have the most money or the people who can vote.
Do you think the United States has a responsibility to have different immigration policies than, like, say, other more closed nations like China or Russia, where it's very difficult to get a citizenship because of our history of immigration?
It's a good question. Yeah, I do. I don't know that the United States necessarily has a responsibility because of our history of immigration. Like, I hope that the United States can become like a moral leader in the world, right? That like it's the right thing to do to like allow asylum like seekers like easy access to like life, right? And like stability, and like not holding 4-year-old children or 4-month-old children in detention camps while we separate their families at the southern border, right? Like that doesn't seem, and really, it's going to be interesting to see the impact of some of these like stricter immigration policies on what like the rest of the world sees as the American dream, right? Like, is that immigration experience now a possibility, or is it like, nope, that's definitely a door that's like on its way shut, let's try to find another option in terms of like seeking asylum or refuge or educational opportunities. Yeah.
How has, as a teacher, affected your perception of like America and the American dream? Because I know that you teach American history.
I don't teach American history, but I do
economics,
teach American government,
Yeah.
U.S. government,
So like, how has that kind of affected? How's like the role of being a teacher?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. My understanding of like my charge or my goals as an educator has definitely changed over time. When I first started teaching, I was like, okay, here's the AP curriculum, like here are the things that students need to learn. They need to understand like how the government works, like what's a special interest group, like how does that work, kind of a thing. What are the campaign finance laws? What are like important public policies that are out there? And I think more and more what I'm thinking about is like, what role can my students play in the country, right, or like in the United States? And so it's much more, I'm trying to make my classes much more about like, what does it look like to work on a campaign, right? Or like, what does it look like to work for an elected official? Or like, what does it look like to be an elected official? What does your time look like? How is it spent? And so it's much less about knowledge and much more about application. Like how can you all decide what kind of citizens you want to be, and what kind of Americans, quote unquote, you want to be? What do you care about, and how can you go about influencing change for those topics, if that makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Do you consider yourself a patriot?
That is a really, really, really interesting question. I think to answer that, I have to share a little bit of a backstory, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. So my hometown is super small. One stoplight, 1 square mile, 1,000 people. Like that's it. And it is a very patriotic town. Like we have an entire day devoted to Flag Day on June 14th. Like we sing all of the patriotic songs. There's literally a parade that leaves from the school, and like the elementary schoolers like walk around town. Like that's what happens. And like we give out our like citizenship awards that day, and so it's a super patriotic town. I feel like because of my identities and because of my friends' identities, like that America or that United States feels restrictive. It's like a very like white, just a very white United States where like we love our troops and like we fly Confederate flags is important to like remember our like national history. And I think that I have had experience where I and my friends have been let down by like that government or like that society in ways where I now see those symbols as like symbols of exclusion. So like to me, the American flag isn't a symbol of inclusion. It's not a symbol of like unity or joining. It's actually a divisive symbol of exclusion. And so I don't necessarily see myself as a patriot. I don't feel attached to the United States. I could very easily see myself moving somewhere else. I do see myself as like a community organizer / humanist. Like I care about people and I care about people's experiences, and like whether they belong to the United States or whether they belong to whatever, like I care more about the person than I do about that kind of a label for myself. So that's a really complicated answer.
That's a good answer.
Do we do one more question? Yeah, I think so.
Do you have anything else you want to add?
I'm curious to know your responses to these questions.
We can ask one more.
Yeah, sure.
Are you proud to be American?
No.
Where else would you rather be from?
I don't know. I can't imagine myself being from anywhere else, but I'm certainly not proud to be an American. I'm not proud of like US policies to intervene in other countries and to like create coups and overthrow leaders. I'm not proud of the systemic racist, classist, sexist, homophobic institutions that have led us to society today. I'm not proud of the way that we talk to and treat each other, right? So, I don't know. Definitely not proud.
Thank you.